Alrighty, folks, it is September of 2025, and boy, oh boy, if you've been living under a rock, then you missed the news we've all been waiting on for literally years and years. Yesterday, September 10th, 2025, we got the second of two final rules that fully implement the CMMC program. For those of you that are new here, that's a program that uses third-party assessments to verify the implementation of contractually obligated cybersecurity requirements for contractors working with the Department of Defense / the Department of War, depending on who you ask these days. The regulation, that final rule that we got on September 10th, officially goes into effect on November 10th of 2025, officially triggering the first phase of CMMC's phased rollout. After that point, November 10th, all new DoD solicitations and contracts will have some level of CMMC requirement in them, depending on the nature of the data that you are handling under your contract. From that day forward, any work that doesn't involve CMMC will be the exception rather than the rule. Everything changes on November 10th. We are hosting a free webinar that's going to break down everything you need to know about the final rule and, most importantly, how to strategize for CMMC success on September 24th at noon Central. We will put the registration link below. It's free, so come check it out, hang it out. Lots of people have already signed up based off of the news, so everybody's welcome. But anyways, Jason, before we get started, you and I have been doing this show for a long time. You and I have been working in this space for a long time. We have been waiting on this final rule for years and years. And now we have the day, November 10th of 2025. What do you think? How are you feeling?
It took me a while to process it. Like, you sit and you reflect and you're like, man, this seems to be the day that even when we started this show, that we were like, trying to anticipate when it was going to come, what it was going to be like, what would happen, what the rule would say by that point in time because of the evolutions that it went through. And it's almost surreal to sit here and think that we now are conducting our first show where there are two rules that fully support the program that we've been talking about for over 125 episodes.
Yeah. Actually, now that you say that, surreal is the word that I've been using, and I've heard a lot of other people, a lot of other OGs in the space use, as it feels very surreal. But now that you say that, we only have a finite number of podcast episodes where it is a pre-CMMC phase rollout world. So we'll have to do a celebration for the last podcast before CMMC is the norm, rather than a thing that we are just continuously speculating about. But anyways, that's not what we're talking about today. We're going to have a whole webinar coming up in 2 weeks that everybody can check out. We're going to put out all the information. We're going to talk about details in the rule, things to know, things that are interesting, details that might not be brought up in a webinar on future episodes. That's not what we're talking about today, because wait. Hold the presses, everybody. Stop. I know that it's going into effect in 60 days, but my leadership just put this on my desk. I heard there's a class deviation thing, a memo thing that got issued a couple weeks ago. And that memo said CMMC is suspended indefinitely. Something's going on about October 1st. Why are you talking about November 10th? What the heck is going on? That's what we're going to talk about today, because we got to nip this in the bud. Literally yesterday, when we found out when the final rule is going to go into effect, I had people messaging me saying, my boss has heard that the rule is here and the phased rollout is starting, but they asked me about this class deviation and they think that it's not happening. That's what we're going to talk about today.
Even posts with news about the rule going into effect, and even with the line at the bottom of the class deviation putting a expiration date on it based on when the rule goes into effect. Even on the post announcing that with the effective date there, people are like, well, what about the class deviation?
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like,
to be fair, we don't get DFARS class deviations related to cybersecurity requirements all that often. The last one that we had was in May of 2024. We did a whole episode about it with the great and powerful Lauren Ayers. That was a class deviation that said, I know DFARS 7012 says do the most recent version of NIST SP 800-171 requirements. That should be Rev 3, but CMMC is going to assess Rev 2. So we're telling you with this deviation, just do Rev 2. If that's news to you, go check out that episode. But anyways,
I don't want to interrupt. I really don't want to interrupt you, but what were two words that really, it's the same word being used in both of those class deviations that we're referencing. What word sticks out to you the most there?
I don't know.
Indefinitely, right? Indefinitely. And how you interpret indefinitely, right? Because some people, I think, are automatically programmed to think indefinite means this endless time lapse continuum.
Permanent. They're saying indefinitely is permanently. Yeah.
But realistically, what the word means is that there's something brewing. We just don't know when it's going to finish brewing. And we don't want to assign a date to it and have to be kind of constrained to that date or anything like that. And so I think that you could read any bit of the writing on the wall and know that this was coming relatively fast. I know if you listen to this show, you should have known that this was coming relatively fast based on all the factors. And I think that that class deviation was just something to subside from. Good Lord, the amount of people that came out and were like, October 1st.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, why did this happen? What is this class deviation? What the heck are we talking about? Okay. So anyways, at the end of August, the DoD issued class deviation 2025-00006. This is the only organization in the world that I know of that uses capital O's and zeros next to each other. Great job, DoD. Anyways, what the heck is a class deviation? A class deviation is an authorized exception to the FAR, the DFARS, the HSAR, all of the acquisition supplements that the government agencies use to buy stuff, right? It's an authorized exception to the acquisition regulations that they use. A class deviation applies to multiple contracts, otherwise known as a whole class, hence the name class deviation. So this is a class-wide change to the regulations that are on the books.
And so what would technically be the class in this case?
Anything that's going to have the CMMC clause in it.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's just going to be basically all DoD contracts because it's going to be prescribed to go in everything with the relevant data types.
Okay.
So these deviations are issued to address what they call urgent needs. This could be things like policy gaps that they've identified, such as the DFARS 7012 issue. There's a gap between two competing policies. It could be legislative demands or anything like that. They issue these deviations to bridge the gap until there can be a change to the FAR or an agency supplement via rulemaking. Because as we know, rulemaking takes a while. You got to address this issue because we're still buying stuff. And so they have this authorized deviation as a temporary Band-Aid until they can do that. So at the end of August, the DoD issued a class deviation, and it was the subject line said, class deviation, use of the clause on contractor compliance with the cybersecurity maturity model certification level requirement. And it was only 2 paragraphs long. It's very quick. And it says, effective immediately, contracting officers shall not use the contract clause at DFARS 252.204-7021. That is the CMMC contract clause. Effective immediately, do not use the clause 7021. Okay. Then it says this class deviation remains in effect until the effective date of the final rule for DFARS case 2019-D041. That's the 48 CFR CMMC rule that was published yesterday. And as we know, the effective date of that rule is November 10th of 2025. So long story short, this class deviation does not suspend CMMC. It does not affect the November 10th effective date. It does not change the phased rollout. It does not override the final rule whatsoever at all, period. So if your leadership is hemming and hawing and hesitating on getting started on implementation to meet their CMMC obligations, then and they're waiving this class deviation in front of you, make sure they read the second paragraph that says this will expire on the effective date of the rule. The effective date of the rule is November 10th of 2025.
Doesn't the rule being published and the effective date being put in place effectively void that class deviation? Maybe not immediately with it being published, but with that effective date, that's voided and it's non-existent.
Well, it's still on the books, right? So right now, the class deviation says don't use the clause 7021. and this guidance expires on the effective date of the rule, at which point you go read the rule and you do what the rule says, essentially, to use the clause at 7021.
Now, how much of that do you think is played into the fact that we know by history DoD uses two clauses to accompany each other? You know, we have 1920, et cetera, and that they knew that there was a clause that we didn't have a number for until yesterday coming out. So it was inappropriately using the clauses now because there's no notice and no notice of intent, right?
Yeah. So it could be that, right? So as we'll talk about in the webinar and things like that. So now rather than just having the DFARS clause 7021 go get a CMMC level, we now also have a DFARS provision that makes you aware of the requirements in the clause. That is 252-204-7025. Coming up in the future, we're going to finish our back to basics episodes where we went through DFARS 7008 and 7012, 7019 and 7020, and now we can complete the series 7025 and 7021. That's not the reason why they issued this class deviation overall, but it's adjacent. So here's a riddle for you, everybody. Here's something to ponder.
I like riddles.
DFARS clause 252-204-7021 has never been authorized for inclusion in any solicitation and contract. It was put on hold indefinitely in March of 2021 when the DoD went into their programmatic review of the CMMC program, and it was still put on hold indefinitely in November of 2021 when they announced CMMC 2.0 rulemaking, which we will finish on November 10th of 2025. So at no point in time has the clause 7021 been allowed to go in any solicitation and contract. If it has been a mistake. It was not authorized. So if it's never been authorized for use, why did we get a class deviation telling people not to use it? Any ideas? Any ideas in chat? Jason, got any ideas as to why this occurred?
No, because I was today years old when I didn't realize that it wasn't technically allowed because we were seeing those requirements pop up and people being like, hey, I know that you're saying that it can't go there, but I have this. So like,
so it showed up in contracts and solicitations, not authorized to be there, right? It was suspended indefinitely, but mistakes get made. Contracting officers shotgun stuff into contracts all the time. We know that this is true for all kinds of clauses, not just for cybersecurity stuff and for CMMC. So remember back to the fact that if you were to Google right now, before November 10th, DFARS clause 252-204-7021, there is a DFARS clause at that address, right? There is a text of a CMMC clause at 7021 right now, because the rule in 2020 that established CMMC 1.0 wrote a rule at 252-204-7021 with the CMMC clause, the original 2020 text of the CMMC clause. So that has stayed online as it was created in 2020 until this upcoming 48 CFR rule that goes into effect on November of 2025 revises the language from 2020. And then that's the new clause, right? The problem is that these rules don't just change the language of the clause. They also update the guidance to the contracting officers about when and how to use these clauses. So they update Part 202 and Part 204 and Part 212, not just Part 252, where the clauses and solicitations live. And if you go look at a part of the DFARS called, let me make sure I get it right. It's 204-7503, 204.7503. This is guidance to the contracting officers about when to use the clause 7021 that was written back in 2020. So back in 2020, the DoD had a 5-year phased rollout plan for putting CMMC clauses into contracts in phases, right? At that time, the original plan was we're going to insert this clause into contracts on a case-by-case basis. The Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment is going to hand select the contracts that will include CMMC. And then 5 years later, it's going to go in all solicitations and contracts. Well, ironically, coincidentally, the end of that phased rollout is October 1st of 2025. The end of the CMMC 1.0 phased rollout is October 1st. So when everybody wakes up and they hear CMMC is here, the rule is right around the corner, it's getting ready to come out, they fire up the Google machine, or they fire up ChatGPT or whatever, and they say, when does CMMC go into effect? And it pulls the current language that was established in 2020, and it says October 1st must go in all solicitations and contracts. But that's not what the rule is going to say when it goes into effect in November. So in order to get around that issue, the DoD saw a policy gap and they issued a class deviation that said, just a reminder, everybody, it's still not authorized for you to use the clause 7021 that we wrote in 2020 until the new version comes out at the effective date of the 48 CFR CMMC final rule. Everybody got this wrong. Industry got this wrong. The CMMC ecosystem got this wrong. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers put an official notice on SAM.gov that said October 1 is the go live date. I've been very disappointed in some of the DoD components' understanding of the relationship between old clause language and upcoming new clause language, but that's besides the point. The real day is November 10th of 2025. This October 1 thing people have been hearing about is an artifact of old 2020 rulemaking. Can't be updated until that new rule goes into effect. Class deviation fixes that policy gap and says, when the new rule goes into effect, go use the clause. Do not use the old clause because the new rule is about to go into effect. That's basically where it came from.
And so I don't know if given that explanation that you just provided, I don't know if I can be completely not mad at the KO for including it, because now it just sounds like they thoroughly went down the checklist that's provided to make sure that the right clauses are inserted into the contract, right? 7503 is that checklist. They scrolled down there like, oh, I guess there's control technical information on this contract. We got to check that. This clause goes in there because preemptively, because rulemaking is a process, right? And because changing huge documents like that is a process. It's not, there's no immediacy to it. You have to have those things in place to make sure the clause goes in when the program was supposed to be live.
Yeah. So, technically it's a little bit of egg on everybody's face, right? Because DoD issued a memo back in 2021 that said, don't use the clause suspended indefinitely, but they didn't issue a class deviation. They probably should have, but they were not expecting CMMC 2.0 rulemaking to take longer than 24 months. So October 1st of 2025 was never going to be an issue. Here we are in September of 2025, and the rule isn't going to go into effect until after October 1st. So they weren't anticipating that this was going to be a problem, but they could have issued a class deviation just to seal it forever. The other, sort of embarrassing thing that people have done to expose themselves is October 1st of 2025 has been at DFARS 204.7503 since 2020. Yeah, right. Yeah. But people only started worrying about October 1st of 2025 like 2 or 3 weeks ago, which tells you people weren't paying attention to what was going on, the relationship between the 48 CFR proposed rule and the final rule, what was already on the books. Because if you were worried about October 1st of 2025 in August of 2025, why weren't you worried about it in December of 2024 when the CMMC program officially went into effect? And the clause says it goes into all contracts in October of 2025. It's because people weren't reading it because they didn't think that it was real. So
I thought it was still going away. And then there was these small things, you find the glimmers. I will say the demonstrated growth by the DoD, not putting a hard deadline on this class deviation and showing indefinitely is one of those, you're not getting me again on this one. So
so there you go.
It doesn't matter anymore. November 10th, bro. November 10th.
So the class deviation, if anybody brings it up, you can just have them watch this episode or just direct them to the last paragraph of the 2 paragraphs that says it expires on the effective date. Effective date is November 10th, and it won't be a thing anymore. It was created because of artifacts of old rulemaking and the fact that the new CMMC 2.0 rulemaking took an extra 21 months, and they just didn't think that the language October 1st, 2025 was going to be an issue. And not enough people were paying attention, and it kind of got crazy, and that's how rumors get started. But won't matter. It'll just be a fun thing that we all look back and laugh on, as many of the things that we've talked about over the years will be. Anyways, like we were saying, T-minus 59 days, everybody, from the time we're having this conversation. Then phase 1, day 1 begins, and we're off into a brave new world. Make sure you check out our webinar. We're going to talk about everything you need to know about the rule, make it into nice, pretty slides that you can show your leadership so that they hopefully make a decision. And we'll go from there. And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.